So by a show of hands, how many of you have purchased something via the home shopping network? Yeah, nobody raises their hands. And you know why we're a little hesitant to admit it? Because we bought into the hype. We were up in the middle of the night, we couldn't sleep, it was the only thing on, and they're telling us that this thing is going to change our life. And in that moment of weakness, we believed it. And we bought it and then realized it never can actually do all that they said it was going to do. Because infomercials and those kinds of things, they always overpromise and underdeliver. They always overpromise but underdeliver. It never lives up to the hype. And I'm convinced that pride is the same way. That it overpromises something for you. You don't even know that that little conversation is happening in your own mind or your own heart. But pride will tell you, we're going to make things better. It's going to be good. And then you realize later, when it's usually too late, that it didn't actually do anything it promised it would do. The two things I think that pride actually does for us is this. I think it keeps us from and causes us to. It keeps us from and it causes us to. I'll give you some examples. It keeps us from initiating an apology. That's usually pride that holds us back. We recognize we're wrong. We might only be 5% wrong, but we know we should be the one that goes into the kitchen or goes into the other office or sits down with our kid, and we should say, we're sorry. But there's something inside of us that holds us back. It keeps us from doing that. Sometimes pride can keep us from being honest with ourselves and honest with others. Because if we were totally truthful, that would change our reputation, or that would change my sense of being right, or my sense of belonging, or whatever the case may be. For some of us, pride keeps us from celebrating other people's victories. There's this weird thing that fires off when someone else gets the raise, or someone else gets the new car, or someone else finds a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you missed out on that opportunity, or it hasn't happened for you yet, and you have a hard time going, yay, you. Because something else seems to be controlling you. It keeps you from, or it causes you to. If any celebrating gets done, you might celebrate someone else's failure, right? We like to see when others lose. We love to know when we can say, I told you so, or I knew it. For some of us, it's that we use our money and we buy things to impress people that aren't actually paying any attention to us. But pride tells us we need to. Pride tells us that we should. It's this insidious, hidden thing in each of us. Pride is scary. And when I talk about pride, I'm not talking about the kind that you might have in your child or in an accomplishment, right? I'm not really talking about the kind of pride where you paint something and you can go, wow, I'm actually pleased with what I did. I'm talking about the yucky stuff. The stuff that's in there that you wish wasn't in there. And when you're in a certain situation and you're experiencing those feelings and those thoughts, you wish they weren't there. But there's something about it that feels like it's out of your control. To go a step further, it feels like it might actually control you. I love the way C.S. Lewis put it. He goes so far as to say, unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness are mere flea bites in comparison to pride. Why? Because pride leads to every other vice. Flea bites are nothing, right? They're these small little things. But Lewis would say, everything else is that compared to pride, because pride is what drives all of the other awful things that we do, and the awful things that we think, and the awful things that we feel. That this comes from this sense of pride in each of us. And here's the scariest part about it. You can't see it in the mirror. You can't go look at yourself and go, wow, you're prideful. We usually don't know we are until someone's bold enough to tell us. And you know what usually happens? We think they're prideful. And it's different than arrogance, because some of us would sit here this morning and we would go, well, I'm not arrogant. I don't go around bragging, and I don't think I'm better than everybody, and so I'm not prideful. There's a fine line. There's a gray area somewhere in there. Pride can be different than arrogance. And so we're not talking about that overt, you're just kind of a jerk. That's none of you. I know that. What I'm talking about is the thing inside of us. The thing inside of us that thinks people owe us, or that we owe it, whatever it is, to ourselves. And if you were to try and point at it, it's evasive. It's like it's always the sign on your back, right? You're just trying to get to it, but you can't really get to it because you don't always know where it comes from. But here's the thing that you need to know, that I need to know, that we need to get our head around and we need to embrace, is that pride diminishes us. Pride actually makes us smaller. We often think of it as the thing that puffs us up, right? Makes us stick out our chest, makes us feel bigger and badder and better than everybody else. But the truth is, it diminishes us in some pretty profound ways. It makes us smaller in terms of our capacity to do some things that are integral or part and parcel to every strong relationship, whether that's a marital relationship or just a neighborhood relationship or a friend at work or whatever the case may be. I think that pride diminishes our capacity to admit things. Admit things, I think, to apologize and to acknowledge. I think if we could introduce each of these ingredients to our everyday life and into all of our relationships, we would be doing something pretty amazing. But our pride diminishes our capacity to do those things. We have a hard time admitting we were wrong. Again, even though sometimes it's a small amount of wrong in the equation, it's hard for us to say it. It's hard for us to acknowledge our faults. It's hard for us to be vulnerable enough and honest enough to say, I'm not able to do that, or I don't have the capability to do that, or I'm lost, right? Like that's the one thing where so many of us, especially us guys, we just never want to stop for directions. That's the old cliche. We have a hard time just admitting we're coming up short, we don't measure up. We have a hard time saying these two words, I'm sorry. Because there's something about those two words that make us, guy or girl, feel weak and feel like we lost. And nobody ever likes to lose. And so it doesn't make us better. That's the overpromise, right? Pride overpromises that it's going to make us better and bigger than somebody else, but it actually makes us smaller. It shrinks us. It makes us less than we could be. And we have to be honest with each other about that. We have to, again, get our head around that idea because we've fallen for the sales pitch. And we're losing out as a result. The other thing that pride does is it crowds people out. Pride crowds people out. Because when there's only you inside of you, there's no room for anybody else. It will start to push people away at arm's length. And here's the switcheroo that got pulled on us. We thought if we were prideful and we had a lot of accomplishments and trophies on our mantle, that people would be drawn toward us, that people would want to be around us. But the more and more we lean into our pride, the more they're repelled by us. And they want to get away from us. And it has this tendency to keep people out, and we don't let people see the real us, and we don't let people understand that we've failed and that we've messed up, and we don't let people see that we need other people in our lives. It deprioritizes the others in the room, and what's amazing is that sometimes it's the people we love most, the people that we're closest to, the people that have always been there. They're the ones that are usually the victim of our pride first. But maybe the scariest thing, maybe the scariest result of pride is that not only can it crowd people out, it can also crowd God out. And that's the part where I want to sit for the next few minutes, because for a lot of us, pride overpromised to the extent that we thought we don't need God, that we don't need church, that we don't need this Christianity thing or this religion thing because we're enough. I'm the man. I'm the woman. right? But here's what David wrote down, a guy who would have struggled with this a lot, probably, because he was a king, and he had a lot of accomplishments. He said, the wicked are too proud to seek God. They seem to think that God is dead. Pride has this adverse effect on our relationship with God. In fact, the Hebrew in this place talks more about that God doesn't even exist. Which is further than God was and then died. He never existed in the first place. And who fills in the vacuum there? Us. I'm God. I'm in charge. I'm the master of my domain. I am the determiner of my destiny. And all of those kinds of things we tell ourselves, right? And the more we behave that way, the more distant God becomes. The more we keep him at arm's length. Because again, we've bought into the lie that we're enough. That we're good enough, we're smart enough, and people like us. And for some of you, this is an important moment. Because we've sometimes thought that we don't do the whole God thing because we're just smart and it's our intellect. But I'm going to challenge you with an idea that I think David has pointed at, and it's this. Your pride, not your intellect, may be what is keeping you from God. You see, some of us would go, well, I just don't buy the whole Old Testament stuff. Like, I don't buy the 6-day creation, and I don't, the whole Jonah in the belly of a fish thing, and the parting of the Red Sea. There's just a lot in there that I can't get behind. And there seemed to be like mass genocide, and God said to do it, and it's very confusing, right? And I understand that that's really confusing. We just say, that doesn't make sense to me. How could a loving God do those things? Or how could this God that created logic and science supposedly do these illogical and miraculous sorts of things? And I just think that what we're having to come to grips with today is that maybe it's not that you're too smart, maybe it's that you're too prideful. Maybe. I know that that's true for me sometimes. It's just hard for me to admit that I'm smaller than God. It's just hard for me to acknowledge that he's God and he could do whatever he wants. Right? The same things that factor into our personal relationships factor into our spiritual relationship and how we view God and how we view ourselves in relationship to God. And pride is this thing that keeps working its way in. And if that's the case, if this is true, what David is saying is true, then I've just come to this conclusion. Saying no to pride is saying yes to God. That in a relationship, in a rightly understood relationship with God, there's not a lot of room for pride. There's not a lot of room for arrogance. There's not a lot of room for, I'm the man. There's really only room for him. And are we okay with that? The good news is getting okay with it changes everything. Getting okay with it actually delivers on the promises that you and I would lean that way for. It's different than the infomercial or the home shopping network kind of sales pitch. You see, for you and I, prison in its core, or pride is a prison at its core. It shuts us in and it locks other people out. And what has happened is we've locked the door and we handed the keys to pride. And it holds us there. Or another way to look at it is we've given pride the remote. And it controls us. Because when you get locked into a prison cell, you are controlled. You can only go so many feet that way. You can only go so many feet this way and that way and that way. This is the definition of your life now. And pride invites us in, locks the door, we hand it the keys, we give it the remote, and now it is in control of us. This is why you feel like sometimes I can't even do anything about the way I'm feeling. I can't even do anything about some of the things that come out of my mouth. Because you actually are having a hard time gaining control again. But here's the good news. When it comes to this relationship with God or this following Jesus thing, is that Jesus offers us a radically liberating version of humility. And I'm going to explain that. But to me, the key that opens the door that allows us to actually be free and no longer controlled by pride, no longer having it define the space in which we can move in our lives, is this radically different understanding of humility that Jesus offers. And over again, Jesus not only talked about it, he exhibited it. This was kind of the chorus. If Jesus' ministry was a song, and you know how songs work, there's a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, and the bridge maybe once or twice, and then you come back to the chorus. It's kind of the reoccurring message of a song. One of the choruses of Jesus' life was this radical humility. The idea that he came with a towel over his arm and not a clipboard. The idea that he came and said, I'm here to serve, not be served. The God of the universe, serving others, doing for others what should be done for him. That's the thing about Jesus. He never asks you to do, be, say, or think anything that he hasn't already, that he didn't model for us. Just think about for a minute when Jesus washes his feet. You've heard this story before, right? It's just before he's about to be crucified and betrayed, and he sits all of his closest friends down in this room, and they're having their meal, and then at one point, Jesus gets up, and he wraps a towel around his waist and puts one over his arm, and he gets the basin, and he starts to wash the feet of his followers, which was reserved for the lowest of the low servants in the house. And here's Jesus, and you know, it's so easy to go through that story again and just blaze through it, but try and put yourself in the room for a minute. It's not a big room. It's really small. In fact, if you go to Israel, you can visit what they think might actually be very similar to the place where Jesus would have been. It's tiny. And there's 12, maybe more, given some of the servers that might have been in there. Burly, hairy, stinky men. Do you know what feet smell like at the end of the day? So imagine that smell wafting over you. Imagine what would have been stuck to the feet of those disciples. Imagine the calluses and all of the nastiness that would have been growing on those feet. And here's the one who made them washing their feet. I mean, talk about radical humility. And the idea that he chose to do it, that's what's so radical about it. That he decided, I'm going to stoop down low, I'm going to bend the knee, and I'm going to serve someone else. If anybody could have been rightly, righteously, justifiably prideful, it was Jesus. But he chose humility. In fact, at one point, Jesus said, the meek shall inherit the earth. I don't know how you define meek, but I think it has a lot to do with humility. Meekness to me was defined once as power under control, like a horse with a bit in its mouth. That's humility, right? And nobody puts that on their mirror. You don't have a sticky note on your bathroom mirror saying, be meek today. Nobody does that. Nobody sits down their kids and goes, hey, today when you're at school, let's be meek. No, we say, let's go and let's make something of ourselves. Let's do something. Let's have some pride in our work and all of those kinds of things. Nobody is championing this idea, but Jesus did. Jesus said, one of the ways that you're going to follow me is you're going to have to become meek. You're going to have to be humble. You're going to have to take all your talent and all your power and all your greatness, and you're going to have to make it small and give it to someone else. You're going to have to leverage it on someone else's behalf. Because that's what I'm going to do. And that's what he did. But pride would never do that. Pride would say, wait. You know how this goes. You get into the argument, you say the thing you shouldn't have said, or that you wish you hadn't said. And you know I should go into that room or into that office or wherever, and I should say, I'm sorry, but I'm going to wait until they cool off. I'm going to wait until I figure out what I need to say. I'm going to wait until the anger that I'm feeling passes. Or when someone else does something great and they deserve a compliment from you. You tell yourself, I'm going to wait because you know what? I don't want him to get a big head. Is that really what you're doing? Or is it just hard for you to admit that they were great? Or when someone deserves that compliment, the part of the waiting that pride might say is you start to say, you were really, really great today. I loved that song. And then pride goes, but wait, you did miss the one note. I mean, not a big deal. Right? This is how it happens so often for us. And then Jesus comes along, he says, don't wait, initiate. You be the one to start. You be totally okay with the spotlight being on somebody else. You be totally okay with being wrong. You be totally okay with being under someone else. You just be okay with that. You initiate. Don't wait at all. Jesus never, ever waited. Paul would say it this way. He said, instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. And then he goes on. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself. He wasn't humbled by someone else. He humbled himself. To steal the line from the genie in Aladdin, phenomenal cosmic power. Itty bitty living space. This was Jesus. Humbled himself with all that came along with being God and made the cosmos and all that, in obedience to God, and died a criminal's death. Was Jesus a criminal? It's not a trick question. The answer is no. Jesus was not a criminal, but he died a criminal's death on a cross. The most humiliating way to die. You see, Jesus modeled this over and over and over again. And ultimately, standing in our place, taking the punishment that I deserve. Because a lot of the things I do in my life are criminal. And Jesus said, I'll humble myself. I'll take all of this and I'll leverage it for you. I'm not going to call down the angels to rescue me. I'm not going to snap my finger and put everybody to death. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to hide. A few years ago, I got to go to Israel, and one of the most profound moments for me was sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus had prayed and he had asked God to spare him, and ultimately where Judas and the soldiers arrived to take him. What's so awe-striking about that place is that when you sit in the garden, you can see Jerusalem. And it's not like off in the distance see it. It's like right there. And when the soldiers and Judas come to get Jesus, it's nighttime. And so I all of a sudden was struck by the fact that Jesus sat here looking at the side of Jerusalem. The only way to get to Gethsemane is come down the side of Jerusalem at night with your torches lit because it's dark and you can't see. And Jesus saw them coming. And it wouldn't have been difficult to run up the mountain of Gethsemane, over the top, and into the wilderness where he could have disappeared and hid. But he didn't. He humbled himself to be betrayed, to be beaten, to be humiliated, to be murdered. For you and me. And here's what Jesus says in return. Scariest thing to say. Follow me. Follow me in that way. You see, when we talk about following Jesus, we sometimes think that means doing a lot of good things, like good deeds, and we give, and we're generous, and we're all those kinds of things. And we miss the central following. The central following of Jesus is eliminating pride, becoming humble, and leveraging all that's good in you for others. Some of us are like, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. This is like the worst sales pitch ever to become a Christian. Maybe, but it's the honest one. And here's, I just take a quick side road just to make sure that you know this. To start following Jesus, you don't have to agree with everything that Christians believe. Not to start following him. And you know how I know that? The first century followers of Jesus followed him for a long, long time before they recognized him as the Son of God. They were just watching him. They were seeing what he was saying and all that he was doing, and they were starting to figure out for themselves who he was. And that is an invitation. Because the invitation to follow Jesus is also an invitation to unfollow pride. It's kind of like on Facebook or Instagram, right? You get that choice of who you're going to follow, and if you click the same button, you can unfollow them. And what's awesome about following Jesus is that it automatically means you unfollow pride, which means you get freed from this prison. The door gets swung open, and you no longer leave the remote control in the hands of your pride. You actually hand the remote control over to Jesus. Because saying no to pride is saying yes to God. And why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we want to hand the remote to someone who died for us instead of leaving it in the hands of something that could actually kill us? So I want to give you 3 questions to help you start thinking through this and wrestling with this. And so if you're writing these down, these will be good things to write down and reflect on, and we can send them to you if you forget, or you can take pictures of the screen or memorize them, or just tell the person sitting next to you to remind you. But I think if you could spend just a few minutes this week thinking through these things, you might be taking your actual first step towards freedom from the pride that controls us all. The first question is this: how does pride manifest itself in you? There are things you do, there are things you say, there are things you repeat that you would never, ever label pride. But if you pulled that label off, you would see that etched right in there is pride. So for some of you, it's your job. And you have a title, and you have an office, or you went to extra schooling, so you have a few letters after your name, and you make sure that everybody knows the letters after your name. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe that's pride manifesting itself in you. Or maybe you love to buy gifts for people, but you give them those gifts in that certain kind of way that makes sure that they know how expensive it was, or that they know how much you had to give up, or how far you had to drive to get it, or whatever the case may be, right? Like you make sure that they know you put a lot into this instead of just giving them a gift, right? Second question, closely related but somewhat different, is this: how do you camouflage pride? It may be the thing that you're just covering it up with some passive-aggressive words, or you're covering it up a little bit with that backhanded comment. You're making sure that the jab lands when you give the compliment. Or, I'm not going to say I'm sorry because I'm not ready to say I'm sorry. Pride will make sure you are never ready to say you're sorry. But you've camouflaged it in, well, I just want to do it with a right heart, or I want to do it with a right attitude, or whatever the case may be. And we just pull a little bit of grass over the top of it to make sure that it blends in and looks righteous. But in the end, we're just playing a game. In the end, it's pride just putting on a mask and having its way in our life, right? Third question is just an honest one. How much longer will you let pride hold the remote? Because you get to make the decision. So, how many more days, how many more weeks, months, years, are you going to allow pride to tell you what to do? Are you going to allow your pride to define your life and your relationships and your family and how you get along with your coworkers or your fellow students? How long? Because what I know about everybody is if I lined you up and I asked you, hey, are you cool with somebody else controlling your life for the rest of your life? You'd go, no, this is my life. And I want to be in control of it. And that's the part that we miss. We've already given up the remote. And we're being operated instead of operating. Now, here's the danger. These 3 questions hit home, right? And this message, kind of the start of this several-week conversation that we're going to have, feels there's this part of you that's probably going, man, so-and-so needs to hear this. And you are already thinking about, I'm going to copy the link on the watch page on the website, and I'm going to email it to them. I'm just going to gently say, right? Like, because we've got pretty sharp elbows, and there's this part of us that's like, are you paying attention? Are you listening? Or make sure you watch this. Or I just thought of you, and I thought I'd pass this along, right? Don't do that. Don't do that until you've wrestled these to the ground for yourself. Make sure that you spend time sitting with God and just being honest with yourself. And allowing Him to be honest with you. And you might not be arrogant, but we all struggle with this in some way, shape, or form. And so for you, it's maybe bigger than just a personal relationship that's been struggling because of pride. It is this relationship with God. And for the first time, you're kind of wrestling with, maybe it isn't that I'm so smart. Maybe it isn't that I just grew up differently. Maybe it's that I've got a pride issue and I don't want to let God in. And I don't want to give Him control. Just realize you've already given it up to something else. So I come back to, why not give control to one who died for you and loves you that much, instead of leaving it in the hands of something that will abuse you and destroy you and all of the relationships around you. So I'm going to pray for you, and we're just kind of getting started in this, so I hope you'll come back next week, and we can talk about this some more. Next week, we're going to look at an Old Testament story and a person that I'm going to guess about 90% of you have never heard of before. And what we're going to examine is, what do we do? So this is kind of an awareness talk, but next week's going to be, well, what do we do once we become aware of it, once we feel it, once we sense it welling up inside of us? What do we do about our pride? So I hope you come back next week, and I hope you'll invite a friend and maybe just warn them ahead of time, hey, we're talking about pride, but I need to hear it. And I want you to hold me accountable to it. That's the way that I would invite them this week, so they don't think you thought they have a pride issue. They're probably not going to come back the next week then, and we wouldn't want that. So let me pray for you, and then I got 2 things I want to share with you before you head out. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thanks so much for your love and your patience with us. Thank you for being patient with our pride. And in the moments where we hold you at arm's length, or we hold the people you love at arm's length, because there's just something in us that won't admit, we won't acknowledge, we won't apologize, we won't fill in the blank. We know that you still stand there with arms wide open. And so, this week we want to lean into those arms. We want to follow you so we can unfollow our pride. And we are so grateful that you've given us this radically liberating version of humility that frees us from our own pride. And so help us to see that and live it out this week. In your name, amen.